Anyone, how many of you have seen the film? If not, I hope you go see it. I hope you pull it up on the web and take a watch, because it is very involved and it gives you a lot more information and food for thought. I'm just giving you a cursory review from my point of reference and the manner in which I was involved. When the buses pull into Montgomery, the rioters are attacked by yet another waiting mob. Reporters, photographers are brutally assaulted and their cameras smashed to prevent the rest of America from seeing pictures of the planned assault on nonviolent young men and women. The Freedom Riders, of course, are arrested in Jackson, placed in Parchment, and believe me, trust me, it is one of the worst prisons in this country. I don't think it's changed much either. Though the president and his brother, the attorney general, think it's over, they and the nation are in for a rude awakening. Instead of violence stopping the riots, more freedom riders follow. All are arrested, all are imprisoned. The riots only end when public outcry forces the Kennedy administration to enforce the laws and rulings prohibiting segregation in interstate commerce. One of the most important aspects of the film that Arsenault captures so poignantly and the filmmaker puts in the film is Robert Kennedy's observations about what he can do to make everything all right. He would go to the Interstate Commerce Commission, because he's an enforcement agency. They make the rules and get everything smoothed out, which meant, I want you to wait now. I've done this. But we read Gordon Allport's All Deliberate Speed. In the South, they talk about all deliberate speed all the time. It's just not time. The time is wrong. It's not right. You need to wait. As you can see, we weren't about to wait. Maybe that had to do with our youth. I'm often asked, were you afraid? The answer is yes. More afraid than many people can imagine. But because my parents had, and one of my classmates here knows, our parents taught us, you get involved. Oh yeah, I'm worried about my job, but you get involved. You be involved. Don't let somebody else do for you what you can do for yourself. Plus the fact we were Baptist Belt children. So we believed that we would be protected. Now, instead of the ride stopping, they continue. They continue until there is an outcry from the administration of such that, well, we're going to have to do something. There's a scene in the film where people are surrounded in the church, and of course it's a lot of the poor folk. They think the riots are over. But also, Governor Patterson, who does not want to lift a hand to protect the rioters, is faced, and now here's where somebody is really in for a rude awakening. When John Siegenthaler shows up in the governor's office, the governor let people know already that one of the people in Alabama he was most afraid of was a fellow named Bull Connor. I mentioned Bull Connor because one of the things you find paramount in the South is that you may have a mayor, but the chief of police or the sheriff runs the town and the county. You may have a governor, but the governor wouldn't go into Birmingham and confront the chief of police in Birmingham, whose name was Bull Connor. If you watch the film, you will hear him say, unapologetically, I'm afraid of that man. I don't know what he's going to do. He knew what he would do. He knew that he would tell everybody else to stay away from the buses. And he would take care of it. And he did. So you go into the southern states and you find that they are police states. How many of you are familiar with states' rights? Could somebody explain to me what states' rights is? Just what you think it is? I need to ask that question. Sam, what's states' rights?
I guess it's the right to do what you want. like what is Article 10 of the Constitution, talks about states' rights, gives the states rights that federal government cannot or should not infringe on.
That's a good interpret. We both political science majors. The reason that is important is because throughout the history of this country, we've constantly heard words like states' rights. Don't get in the way, and we're hearing them now even more. What's the cattleman's name out in Nevada, who's been grazing on public land for the last 20 years and not paying his fine?
Bundy.
What is it?
Bundy.
Bundy. There's danger in it. If you want a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, you have to be one of the people. You cannot be opposed to being governed or taxed. Subsequently, when we run into folk like that, we have to take a back step. Everyone right now has this illusion that this cattleman and his paramilitary friends have won. The reality is that life and blood was not shed, lives were not lost, because I learned very early in life, you can't take a dagger to a tank fight. My point, of course, being that when we get back to the point of states' rights, we're talking about states deciding that the federal government cannot impose their will on them. For example, voter registration, which became my baby. After Reconstruction, there were grandfather clauses. Excuse me. Before Reconstruction, slaves weren't free, so they didn't vote, so their grandparents weren't on the register. That was one. One of the things that didn't actually disappear until the 60s in a lot of states was something called a poll tax. You know what a poll tax? Anybody know what a poll tax is?
Yeah.
Young person over there, tell them what a poll tax is.
It's like you have to pay a certain amount of money to like vote.
Absolutely. Even the military, there was a military poll tax. $2, but you paid it. Now, can you imagine poor black folk who are looking for work, tenant farmers and what have you, got to buy grain from somebody over here who owes into the next year for the grain he bought last year and for the clothes that he bought at the general store, having $2 extra to go vote. Well, that was getting in the way. So they came up with my favorite one. You also have a sheet of paper on that. I'm going to move through now. The most basic right of a citizen in a democracy is the right to vote. Without this right, people can be easily ignored and even abused by their government. This, in fact, is what happened to African-American citizens, not just African-Americans, but across the country. Indians, Hispanics, etc., depending on your part of the country. Despite the 14th and 15th Amendments guaranteeing the civil rights of black Americans, their right to vote was systematically taken away by white supremacist state governments. Please note, in my incarnation, there's birth, there's training, there's involvement, and then there's venturing into the belly of the beast. I'm on an assignment in Carolina. I haven't been assigned, no matter how many groups I waited in or coordinated for. They'd say, we're ready for our next group, and I would step up. And they said, no, John, we need you to go to Wisconsin. No, John, we need you to go help in the sit-ins or the protest marches in North Carolina. A friend of mine often says to me that I just had, I think, victim's remorse or something like that. I didn't understand what he meant. I did. I had not faced, I didn't think, the brutality that Freddie and Hank and Genevieve and some of my friends and even Matthew Walker or Reverend Leroy Wright, who lives in New York, who was also from Nashville, I went to high school with. They were all beaten and jailed. One of my friends was even beaten by a jailer in Parchman. So I was feeling always, I'm involved, I'm engaged, I'm raising money, I'm going around with Freddie and Jim Squird, but I just didn't feel like it was happening to me. I felt like I was rising, floating above everything, looking down. Now please, I don't have no death wish. I just want you to understand. But while I'm participating in a protest demonstration in South Carolina, I decided I would volunteer to work with Robert Bob Moses, the head of SNCC's Mississippi Voter Registration Project, as a registration trainer in Macomb, Mississippi. The purpose was to train local blacks, citizens, to interpret the 1890 Constitution of the state of Mississippi as amended and practice the registration test administered by local unsympathetic registrars. Now, in this letter, I'm given my assignment to participate. I go to Macomb, I get my training, and I'm sent to Macomb. I leave Macomb, and my assignment is in a place I thought Jackson, Anniston, and these other places were pretty bad, until I started doing my research before I go to the city and finding out that Tylertown, Mississippi was one of like an Anniston or Montgomery or a Birmingham was even worse. Mississippi, by far, and whatever you read, has always had the title of being the most violent, racist, hate-mongering state in all the 50. Let me tell you personally, it lived up to its title. Bob Moses, when I met him in Macomb, on my right, your left, that's him in 2012 when I met with him and the veterans of the Mississippi Civil Rights Movement in Mississippi. Today, people register to vote without a regard to race or color by signing their name and address on something like a postcard. But it wasn't always that way. Sorry. Go the other way. Here is an image from an actual voting office, registrar's office in, I believe this one was taken either in Louisiana or Mississippi. But just to give you an idea, applicants for registration must be completely filled out without any assistance or suggestion of any person or memorandum. I won't read the whole thing, but I will just give you a gist of it. In 10 days, they would give you a notice. Your names would be, and addresses would be published in the paper, and for 2 consecutive weeks, by the way. And they wouldn't rule on it until 14 days after that, whether or not your registration had been accepted. It'll take as long as 33 days before we can give you an answer as to your application being accepted or rejected. Your indulgence is appreciated, the registrar. The registration procedures, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, and registers who enforce them were just one part of this interlocking system of racial discrimination and oppression. Please remember now, bear with me, all the while the freedom rides are going on, I'm now moving between Tennessee, North Carolina, Alabama, and now, North Carolina, and now I'm in Mississippi. There was a little schism of sorts because people thought we were spreading ourselves out too much. You know, you got sit-ins going here, you got protest marches going there, you got freedom rides, which you ought to save yourselves and get out of that. But they were serving their purpose. And the issues were broader than, 1, a lunch counter, 2, riding on a bus. There were other, what was the old expression? There were bigger fish to fry. If intimidation, harassment, beating, false arrest, and economic pressure proved insufficient, the Ku Klux Klan was ready with violence and mayhem, cross burnings, night riders, church bombings, and arson of business and homes. Today, these people would be called terrorists. But back then, the establishment saw them as defenders of Southern heritage and the Southern way of life. We still hear some of those expressions now. Take your hands off my Medicare. I don't want Obamacare, which I keep reminding folks is not an insurance policy, but a law, which I'm sure most of you know. Mississippi in the 60s was the poorest state in the nation, with 86% of all white families lived below, all non-white families lived below the national poverty line. In addition, the state had a terrible record of black voting rights violations. In the 1950s, Mississippi was 45% black, but only 5% of voting age blacks were registered to vote. Some counties did not have a single registered black voter. Whites insisted that blacks did not want to vote, but this, of course, was not true. According to Bob Moses, this is Mississippi in the middle of the iceberg. Following my orientation, I was assigned to set up training classes in Tylertown, Walthall County, Mississippi. I was later joined by 4 local people, wonderful young men, Jimmy Travis, MacArthur Cotton, and George Lowe. I mention them specifically because they are native Mississippians. They know the turf, and this is why I mention them. Although we were in the middle of Bob Moses' iceberg, the black citizens of Mississippi opened their homes and hearts to us. They treated us like family. They housed us, they fed us, their home, they provided transportation, they worshiped with us, entertained us, and yes, most importantly, they permitted us to put them in harm's way. You see, it's one thing to fly into some place, to stand up and raise a banner, and then leave and go back up north to Nashville, which is what they thought of. Anybody who came in from outside was from up north. But Jimmy Travis, MacArthur Cotton, and George Lowe, college students, were ready to lay down their lives for the right to vote. A couple of other people who joined us had come off the Freedom Rides, their bus got out of jail, and then joined us in Macomb. As I was often reminded by Ms. Edith Peters, one of my senior students, I'm tired of waiting for my freedom. I've waited too long. She was also one of the people who housed some of the Freedom Riders, who housed the voter registration workers, who put their lives on the line. Now here's an interesting fact. Both Ms. Peters and Mr. Wilson, the landowners, 400 or 500 acres of property between them, farming implements, farm animals, grazing land, and crops. They had money. They had means. But they didn't have that basic right. They could not vote. And if you've seen films where brothers and sisters walk off the sidewalk, the most humiliating thing I've ever seen in my life, where a little white child is walking down the sidewalk with his mama and looks up and calls that person, "You dirty nigger, get off the sidewalk." It happened. Believe it or not, it still happens. I have a lot of adopted students. They're from Iraq, Iran, Mexico, etc. They often remind me, "Mr. Hardy, you ain't the only one that gets profiled. We get profiled too." And I say, yeah, it is. Ms. Peters said, "I've waited long enough." And in these classes, we would issue facsimiles. I also handed you out a 3-page facsimile. It's very important that you understand why. If it wasn't the sheriff, it was the registrar, and more often than not, they didn't have as much education as the people we took in to register to vote, or to attempt to register to vote. On this facsimile, there's a sample of the application. And please notice, if you remember the sign on the wall, they always knew where you lived. They knew where you worked. And they could get you fired or get you killed. But they would ask questions on the Constitution on the Constitution of the state of Mississippi as amended. Now, my first experience to take people in after setting up my registration, our registration school at Mount Moriah, 5 African-American citizens went to the registrar's office who had gone to our class, and 2 completed the registration form on the first attempt. Now, this was the first attempt made to register Negroes, the first not only since the school had been created, but also the first since the Justice Department lawsuit earlier that year. 2 of the 5 were allowed to take the test. One was a teacher, Miss Ruby McGee. She was a senior political science major at Jackson State University, the black state school. The teacher and the political science student both failed the test, being deemed unsatisfactory by the registrar. Following our attempt to register, I was stopped, questioned by the sheriff. Article appears in the paper. Remember, I mentioned Bible Belt earlier, and after this article appeared, I was not only deemed a communist, but I was also deemed an atheist. That's one of the worst things you can be in the South. Now, by the time Ms. Peters and Mr. Wilson are ready to go register to vote, I accompany them to Tylertown. The registrar tells them that he can't register them because they're already in court. He calls me into the office, pulls a pistol from his desk drawer, and commences to pistol whip me. Mr. Peters, Mr. Wilson helped me out. I look for the sheriff. Naive me, I'm thinking, I'll tell the sheriff. He'll arrest the registrar. He arrested me for disturbing the peace and inciting a riot. Later, they charged me $100 fine. That was the bail. And I'm spirited out of Mississippi into Atlanta, where I work with Julian Mahon, the SNCC office there. But I will conclude with these observations. That was my how do you say it? My christening by the fire and wrath of these powerful people who didn't have high positions, but they had controlling positions. The sheriffs, the registrar, etc., etc. Now, I will conclude with this. I attended the 7th annual conference of the Veterans of the Mississippi Civil Rights Movement, and the welcome greetings were delivered by Mayor Harvey Johnson, a Tennessee State University graduate in 1968. In 1997, Johnson made history by being elected Jackson, Mississippi's first African-American mayor. More than 70% of the voters chose him to lead Mississippi's capital city. In 2001, Jackson voters again chose Johnson for a second 4-year term as mayor. In 2009, he was elected for a 3rd term, a landslide. On June 4, 2013, Detroit native and longtime civil rights activist Chokwe Lumumba was elected mayor with 87% of the vote. Unfortunately, he died of a possible heart attack after only 6 months in office. The city of Jackson, as of this day, is 80% black. It appears that since we elected our first African-American president, which Robert Kennedy predicts in his interview in the Freedom Riders film, the specter of overt racism has come out of the closet to take away the rights we've gained. Instead of white sheets, we see business suits and conservative misinformation campaigns, such as the efforts to distort our president's accomplishments, Obamacare, weakening the Voting Rights Act, and restrictive voter ID laws, the lack of universal support of the livable wage, or the rights of women and immigrants. Further, if we don't educate our people to the reality of the current socioeconomic and political changes that are occurring all around us, we'll find ourselves revisiting the themes of the pre-60s all over again. This is the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Please, at your leisure, many of you may already have seen it, understand Section 5. President Barack Obama's election did not signal the end of the struggle, but rather how much harder we have to fight to preserve the rights we've already attained. A war does not end when the treaty is signed. That's when the real work begins. The fight for civil and human rights is an ongoing process. My history, your history, is my history. Thank you.
We do have about 25 minutes for Q&A, discussion. I can hold the chair if you want. Because nobody's going to ask me any questions, trust me.
I know why I sat down. Anybody have any questions? First of all.
And Kim and I can kind of, because we're a bigger group, we can kind of help you out there. So I know she's got.
In your school, how many of your actual students pass their literacy test?
Say it again.
The students in your school, how many of them actually pass their test?
During the time I held my registration school, I had no one to pass. The day that Ms. Peters and Mr. Wilson went was the last day that we actually had any attempts made, because following that, I was arrested, placed in jail. They had to escort me out of that jail, took me over to Magnolia, to another jail. By the way, Bob Moses had been beaten by the sheriff's cousin 2 weeks before that and put in that same jail. So once I left, the biggest wave of accomplishment in terms of voter registration occurred during what is called Freedom Summer. This is the 50th anniversary of Freedom Summer, and it'll be held in Tougaloo and Jackson this year. In fact, we still have a group of young people leaving Detroit on another wave of what we call the second, or the rebirth of the Freedom Rides. And this is like the second or third, I'm sorry, it's been longer than that, because Dorothy Dewberry Aldridge takes the young people on that trip. Question? Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Hardy, when Martin Luther King was assassinated, how old were you? And at the time he was assassinated, how did you feel about it, or what were you doing?
That was
68.
1968, right?
Yeah.
You know, I'm old, I forget. What was I doing? 1968, I have to stop. I'm sorry. I believe at that point I was working on government contracts and building nonprofit housing. For example, in the March on Washington, people asked me, what were you doing? I was a ranger for the National Park Service. I was one of that first wave of young blacks who became a ranger for the National Park Service, and yet the original rangers, by the way, many of you know that story, were the Buffalo Soldiers of the National Parks.
And Yosemite.
That's right. And so in 1968, I had federal contracts working for the Nonprofit Housing Center in Washington, D.C., later Kansas City, and running a federal contract in 5 southern states.
So that period, most of the time when I hear people talk, I hear their personal statements about that day, what they were doing when they heard the assassination of Martin Luther King. And it was like, for example, it was one lady, she said, I had my child in her hand and I was, giving her milk. And she said, and I heard about it, she says, like I jumped up and I could only just put the baby on the sofa. I was just so in shock. So that's, I'm trying to.
That's what you, okay. I was actually in a car driving from Nashville